Welcome to your second part, part B of your Core 1. Hello again, my name is Tara Brabazon, and this part jumps straight into the candidature and looks at blockages, looks at challenges, things that might slow your students down. So the key questions that are guiding this particular component is who owns your students' work? And also, do you have the right to add your name to a PhD student's article? So it's very important that these discussions about ownership of ideas emerge really early in the candidature. To be frank with you, I have this discussion in the first meeting I have with my PhD students, and they must be handled with decency, with transparency, and also with respect. And if any challenges emerge, you have great colleagues through your faculty to offer advice, and also the Office of Graduate Research is available to you anytime to discuss through these issues in a robust, kind and compassionate fashion. These are key issues because these types of matters can break down a supervisory relationship and create profound cultures of resentment. The first issue we really need to deal with is intellectual property. Now, IP is, of course, a legal term that assigns ownership to an individual or a group of individuals. It can involve confidentiality. It can certainly involve conflict. The faculties in particular are really enabling and helping our students move through these issues. But if you'd like to read university level policy on it, and it's very clear, very good, go to the Flinders website under, I think it's Policy and Secretariat, and there's a fantastic, very clear section on IP. So bottom line, the university owns the IP that's produced by staff, quote, in the course of their employment, end of quote, but of course we hold the right to publish with the legal rights that come through publication. Students are different. Students own the IP they create. Students own the IP they create. The university may require that the students sign over that IP, but that's negotiated before the work commences. And when commercially funded projects are in place, IP and confidentiality agreements must be in place before any work really commences. The other great deal breaker in research that creates this antagonism between student and supervisor is the complexity of ethics approvals. Research cannot proceed without that ethics approval. Terribly important in a lot of social sciences and a lot of sciences. And it can hold back an entire candidature, adding months to the length of that candidature. So basically, straight after the IP discussions are in place, I would go straight to ethics, work out what is required, and get those forms in as soon as possible. We have incredibly distinguished and fantastic committees at Flinders that deal with these ethics issues. They will support you. So of course, human ethics, particularly for our social science colleagues, looking at interviews and also surveys, but animal welfare, biohazards, all the really important stuff. Another key pressure point that exists in a candidature is the annual review of progress. And at the moment that's due in June 30 each year, but I'm simply, for you guys in 2016, I'm going to discuss this in generalities, because the university right now is transforming this annual review of progress. So I'm just going to talk about the key issues for you to think about with your student, knowing that in future years, from next year, it's going to look a lot different and it's going to be heavily digitised. So while the processes and the forms may change, the reason it exists is absolutely crucial. Now, I understand most academics absolutely despise filling in forms, and I understand why. You want the relationship between the supervisor and the student to remain private, to remain confidential, and I always assume, as all our colleagues do, I always assume that every supervisor knows exactly what you are doing. I come to you with respect, with intellectual integrity, and say, right, well, you're a supervisor. I come to you with respect. I assume you know what you're doing. Full stop. Now, 20 years ago, the scrutiny over supervisors was, at best, light touch. But this regulation and regulatory framework has increased enormously in the last 20 years, and particularly it's got a bit punchy in the last 10 years. And to be frank with you, I'm not against regulation. I'm not against transparency at all. In fact, I'm in favour of regulation. And the reason for that, there are many reasons. The first one is universities are paid by the public purse. And therefore I am very comfortable and believe in public accountability for the work that we do. But also I want to ensure that our doctoral candidates are always supported, that they're okay. And the reason for that, and most of us who have been around universities long enough, and I'm impossibly old and you're all fabulous and young and glorious, but most of us who have knocked around universities for 20 years or so, we've seen some dreadful stuff from supervisors, really appalling stuff. So after you've seen that type of horror, you're probably a little bit less worried about regulation of supervisory behaviour. So that's why an annual review of progress exists in some form. And that's why I'd ask, instead of you seeing it as an inconvenience, can we invert this discussion a little bit? I know forms, but instead of seeing them as an inconvenience, can I just put a phrase for you to consider, to think about, and that is supervising PhD students is a privilege. It's a privilege. It's not a right. And because it's a privilege, there are particular accountabilities that are required. It's also important that we share best practice. You are a fantastic supervisor, so we need to share that best practice throughout the university. This is important, I think, and that's why we do need to have this quite robust conversation about compliance through to excellence. If this annual review of progress exercise is seen as a ticker box gig, then it's completely pointless. So what I beg of you is don't treat it like a ticker box exercise. What we need is a robust and a clear commentary about what is working and what is not. And we need you to use your judgment and tell us about those variables as early as possible in the candidature. So to solve a problem, we have to name a problem. And I understand that many supervisors don't want to admit weakness, they don't want to admit problems, and if they do, they're frightened that, oh right, they'll be under scrutiny. Look, that's not the case at all. This is not what it's about. It's not a disciplinary action. What all of this stuff is about is protecting that student. If the student needs help, we have all these resources to help them, but we need to know that they need help. Yeah? So remember, I'm in a weird situation. A Dean of Graduate Research, a Dean of Graduate Studies around the world, we see all the problematic cases, okay? So I have the students coming in, sobbing their guts out, okay? They're the students I see. So it means, again, I'm seeing a lot of not false positives, I'm seeing a lot of false negatives when we're dealing with supervision. So I need to just understand the context of the supervision. I will never, ever, 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 ever disrespect a supervisor or disrespect our faculty colleagues. I don't have that in me to do that. We have an environment of care and love and compassion and respect, and all of us care about those students. That's what we're here for. So this is about us working together in the best interests of our doctoral candidates, and I know together we can do this. So it is important to be clear and honest on that form, and do log any challenges in as much detail as you can, and once you've done that, a plan can be put in place to help that student. There's nothing weirder than being in a position like I'm in at the moment where, and I'll tell you what happens, this happens to all deans around the world, student comes in sobbing, saying that, you know, everything's terrible and the candidate is terrible and everything's a mess, and I go to their annual review of progress form and it's all sweetness and light. For the last 2 years, everything has been fantastic. So I'm sort of sitting going, wow. So therefore we have to diagnose a bit more deeply. If we've got some record on the form, then we can resolve stuff earlier. So if you can treat it as a favour to me, as a transparent and a robust process to acknowledge what's going well and the challenges as early as possible, then we will get those students through in the minimum time. You've got to name a problem to solve that problem. So on those forms, it's a really straightforward protocol, if you will. Review the progress of the previous year. So how has that gone? tell me what's going to be happening in the future, and present anything that may be causing a bit of a rub, a bit of a problem in that candidature. Okay, and remember, our goal is a timely completion. The challenge we have in Australia is right now the definition of a timely completion is changing. Pretty clear, I think, for our master's colleagues, it's 2 years, that's cool. For our prof docs, a lot of those guys and gals are 4 years, noting the coursework. But for a PhD, and this is where it gets really challenging, the scholarship is for 3 years. And they can apply for an extension. Apply does not mean they will get it. So when colleagues start talking about a PhD as 4 years, you can see the problem. There's this confusion between the scholarship finishes, they have to apply for an extension which they may not get, and yet people are aiming for 4 years. So, you know, the difference between 3 and 4 years is quite a lot. So for me, whenever I take on a student, the expectation is that they finish in 3 years. That is the deal. That's always been my aim as a supervisor. I can figure all my milestones to get that completion in 3 years, not 3.5, and certainly not 4. There's a reason for that. The cost of overtime candidatures is enormous. Enormous to the supervisor, enormous to the student, and in fact enormous to the country. And also ask yourself, whenever you're thinking, oh, does it matter that much if it's 3.5 to 4? Think about it. What's a year of your life worth? What's a year of your life worth? So when you're thinking, let's get it through in 3 years, let's get it through in 4 years, just remember that question. As universities, we're currently moving through a discussion about milestones, and each faculty has its own milestones document. Once more, Flinders, we're trying to bring all those milestones together so all the faculties, regardless of discipline, can start to agree and have those really productive interdisciplinary discussions. So that's great. That's happening at the moment. But it is also important that you log and you share with colleagues what may hamper a timely completion. Now, these are professional judgments. These are your judgments as a supervisor, and I respect those judgments. If the candidate is lacking skills, and that's often something that stops them reaching success in 3 years, then swing in those professional development programs as early and as quickly as possible. We also have, and a big shout out to David and all the wonderful librarians, it's just an amazing, beautiful library at Flinders, and these incredibly amazing librarians. So if there are information literacy or information management challenges, please use our wonderful librarians. It is such a privilege to work with them. As I always say, a library is the cranium of a culture. It is certainly the heart and the brain of a university, and we're so lucky to have them. And these information literacy, information management programs really matter because reading and writing ability matters enormously in a PhD. This is so important. The characteristic of students who do not do well in examination, and indeed who fail, is that they got the pitch wrong on the reading that they were enacting. So they were reading too low. They weren't reading high enough in the scholarly literature. So often during their candidature, my students will have a crazy conversation with me where I go, lift, 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 lift. So particularly in the first year, I have to tell them, team, lift your reading up. Get to the high level, high theory, high scholarly literature. Now reading matters because that's a deal breaker for pass-fail. Writing and writing skills, a bit more complicated. They tend to be a bit more incremental. So through the candidature, their writing will improve, but certainly introduce PD as soon as you can if it is required. Therefore, be aware of your faculty milestones and use those milestones as the benchmarks for your supervision. If you like using a bit of language, backward map it. So here's your milestone, backward map those on your annual planning. And if the candidature is not going well, and let's hope it always goes well, but if it has some problems, a student is going to receive a show cause letter, and that letter comes from the supervisor or indeed the Faculty Research Higher Degrees Committee chair. Both can request this letter. It asks the student why they should be permitted to continue. So the burden of proof is on them. They have to make the case. Sometimes it becomes clear the candidate cannot reach the level of scholarship required for a PhD. That's a show cause. But other things happen. Students disappear. They don't come to meetings. They stop reading. They stop writing. All of that's about show cause. And therefore, to be frank with you, I'm pretty comfortable with that letter because it is andragogically sound. It's asking the students to comment on what they're going to change. What are they going to do to make sure they reach the levels that we expect of them? The question for us as supervisors is how we help them so they don't reach this point. The answer, I think, is a clear discussion of expectations at the first supervisory meeting. So, for example, organise regular meetings. I meet my students weekly. Expectations of written work, continual discussion of reading, ensuring their interpretation is lifting every single week, and also ensuring that the material the students are reading is of standard. That's becoming increasingly crucial, I would argue. Online environment, lots of blogs. We need to make sure the standard is high. There's all sorts of other triggers that emerge during a candidature, those moments of challenge about whether or not a student will stay in the program or leave. So let me just present some facts for you for your consideration. The longer the candidature, the less likely the student is to finish. The more frequent the supervisory meetings, the more likely the candidate is to finish. And the more frequent the supervisory meetings, the shorter the candidature. So the characteristics of the students that do not finish are pretty clear. Firstly, they change supervisors. Secondly, they suspend their candidature for a period. Now, I'm not arguing against changing supervisors. If things go bad, and they often do, then it is important to change supervisors. But do it with care, do it as early as possible in the candidature, and do it with respect for all parties. So the question is how you, yes you, are going to handle difficulties. So let me present to you some scenarios that have happened to me in my supervisory practice, and you think about how you would handle them. So, two students you're supervising are in a long-term relationship. In the final 6 months of the candidature, they break up. What are you going to do to make sure both of them get through? A student suffers a divorce through a candidature, increasingly common. A partner of one of your students suffers a major debilitating illness. A candidate becomes pregnant in the first couple of weeks of a candidature and then delivers that baby at 7.5 months, stillborn. A student comes out as gay, lesbian, trans during the candidature. And a really common one, students gain a job through the candidature, so you have to manage the movement from full-time to part-time study. Now, that's just a few. And these types of scenarios are about you, about your leadership, about your intelligence, about your resilience, about your compassion. In most candidatures of 3 years, something very, very serious will happen in those 3 years. Think about your life, think about my life. Every 3 years, something absolutely appalling happens. So our students are no exception. We need the intellectual and emotional resources to be able to help them through it. Now, Nick Lowe, and I'm an enormous fan, recorded a great track, and it was his big hit actually, Cruel to Be Kind. Now, I'm not saying supervisors should be cruel. We should never be cruel. We should always be kind. But I think it is important that we force ourselves and our students to always have those difficult conversations. Ignoring a problem does not make it go away. So often I've found, and you might find this in your experience too, and do email and talk to me about this, when bad stuff happens to a candidate, personally or socially, the PhD almost becomes a life raft. It becomes the one good thing that's happening in their life that's able to get them through the rest of their life. So don't give up on the PhD. So our aim is to create a postgraduate culture without excuses. We need to provide examples of that for students. So I'll give you one now. Remember I talked about my extraordinary PhD student who got pregnant early in the candidature and then gave birth to a stillborn baby 7.5 months in. Appalling experience, never forget it. Every day that image is with me. It cuts me up to this day, as it should. But the remarkable thing about the resilience of that young woman is she went on to finish her PhD in 3 years, 2 months. She's had 2 wonderful, wonderful kids, gorgeous kids, and right now, on this day, she is a fantastic academic in an Australian university, a remarkable teacher, a remarkable researcher, changing the world every day. What a fantastic human being she is. So as you can see, good supervision can change lives. It's never about ticking boxes, and it's never about compliance. It's about excellence. Excellence delivered with love, with compassion, and with respect.